Hi folks, and welcome back to The Original Church. You know, I've been having a lot of fun doing these videos out on my lanai, but as you can tell, we've got airplanes going overhead and it's a little windy today, so we're going to see if this is going to work, but I may have to move inside. Now, did the original church teach original sin? It turns out that the answer to that question depends on how you define original sin. If original sin is something that rules out free will, then no, it did not exist in the original church. But it did exist if original sin means something that makes life in this world a struggle, resulting in what Paul describes in this way in Romans 7. What I do not understand, for I do not do what I want, but I do what I hate. Have you ever felt like that? I know that I have. And so if that's what you mean by original sin, then yes, the original church did teach that we all have this burden. Now, St. Augustine is often credited or blamed for the doctrine of original sin. But as I always tell my students, he didn't invent it, but he did turn it up to 11. And I often use this example. If you have children, you already know this. But if you don't have children, maybe someday you will and you'll understand. But you can look at a kid who has cookie crumbs all over his face, and you can say, "Did you eat that cookie?" And the kid can look you right in the eye and say, "No, I didn't eat that cookie." And you think to yourself, who came into my home and taught my kid how to lie? Well, Augustine himself points out that a little child can lie and even steal, and that's proof of original sin. And you know what? I kind of think that's true. But this is where St. Augustine is a kind of a transition from the original church to what we might call the medieval mindset. The early Augustine was really on the same page with the original church. There is such a thing as original sin that makes us tend towards selfishness, but the human will is still free to reject God's will or free to participate with it. But then along came this monk named Pelagius. And Pelagius was a heretic for several reasons, and we're not going to go into depth about that now. But Pelagius got one thing right. He said, if there is no free will, then God can't blame us for sin. Well, this made Augustine mad, and Augustine took on Pelagius, and in his arguments against Pelagius and later followers of Pelagius, Augustine went to the other extreme. And by the end of his life, Augustine had basically invented Calvinism. Now, that is to say, his disappointments with his own lack of self-control and his disillusionments over heresies and heretics had made Augustine pessimistic about human nature. And he came to the conclusion that human nature is totally fallen, or to use much later Protestant language, totally depraved. And that the human will was not really free, maybe free to want to do what is right, but not free to actually do it. Augustine concluded that the human will is only free to sin. Okay, I've turned the laptop a little bit because the sun is setting and I was getting a lot of light on one side of my face. And yeah, I know in these videos I've got a lot of shadows on my face and stuff like that, but what am I, Steven Spielberg? I'm not in this for production values. So anyway, let's remember, Augustine was born in the middle of the 4th century, after the Council of Nicaea. He was baptized as what we would call a young adult in the year 386. This is only 6 years after the Roman Empire was declared officially Christian, and only 5 years after the Second Ecumenical Council, the Council of Constantinople in 381, where they finished the Nicene Creed. So you have to put Augustine in context and remember that everything he does is driven by two things. Number one, opposing the major heresies of his time, Arianism, Donatism, and Pelagianism. And number two, He's dealing with the fact that a lot of people are becoming Christian, but not necessarily for all the right reasons. Because now Christianity is not only legal, it's official, it's fashionable, it's good for networking. And so he's upset that people are getting baptized without sincere faith. And so he has this kind of pessimistic attitude toward human nature. Before Augustine, original sin was never something that negated free will. But by the time of Augustine, the concept of original sin was all tied up with other issues, like how the image of God in humans is corrupted by sin, and how that corruption is propagated throughout the human race and human nature itself. For example, is original sin transmitted by procreation from one generation to the next? By the way, don't blame St. Augustine for the connection of sexuality with sin. For that, you can blame a guy named Clement of Alexandria in the late 2nd century. He was the guy who said, whatever it is, if you like it, it's a sin. Now, to be fair, he was opposing early Gnostics who had said that people should not procreate because they should not participate in creation. They thought procreation and any participation in the material world was gross. And so Clement of Alexandria goes to the opposite extreme from the Gnostics. And he seems to be the first one to say that sex is only for procreation. Well, anyway, there is no clear consensus on any of these issues in the original church. And so we're not going to spend time on these issues, important as they are. For now, it's enough to say that there was a consensus on this. Sin has affected all of human nature, making us, as the human race, estranged from God from the start, from birth. And all the church fathers would agree that, left to our own devices, we could not receive salvation. The corruption of our common human nature makes it impossible for us to bring about reconciliation with God through obedience or through any effort of our own. This is why Jesus took on our human nature in order to overcome sin for us. And this is why it has always been understood that it's good for infants to be baptized. In any case, by the end of his life, Augustine had emphasized God's grace to the point of diminishing human free will. Now, the Eastern Church never got on board with Augustine on this point. And in fact, it was partly because of Augustine that the Western Church went more towards an emphasis on original sin over against free will. So in a very real sense, differences between the East and the West begin in the 4th century with Augustine in the West, and to a certain extent, I would say, also with the Cappadocian Fathers in the East. But this makes Augustine part of the transition out of the original church and into the medieval church. The real question is whether original sin makes humans totally depraved. If you say no, then you understand original sin like the original church did. If you say yes, then you understand original sin in a different way. But the bottom line is whether original sin takes away free will. The early Augustine agreed with the original church and said that it does not. The later Augustine deviated from the original church and said that it does. In the original church, it was never original sin versus free will, or free will versus grace, as if they are in some kind of inverse relationship. The more original sin, the less free will, or vice versa. I think it was really Augustine who did that, who created that kind of inverse relationship. Now, at the risk of oversimplifying, Augustine just got more pessimistic about human nature over the course of his lifetime. And this shift from optimism, in terms of the reality of free will, to pessimism, this is a factor in the shift from the original church, which is still in the classical world, to the medieval church in the medieval world. But look, I don't want you to take this video as a lesson on Augustine, because Augustine is a huge topic. He wrote a lot of things, and you simply cannot encapsulate him in one video or even one lecture. So if you want to read up more on Augustine, I highly encourage you to do that. But look, Augustine knew this. The most basic thing is God is love. But Augustine lost sight of the fact that for love to be love, it has to be voluntary. And since love is voluntary, or it isn't love, there has to be free will. But Augustine traded away free will in order to put all of the emphasis on God's grace. And in doing that, he redefined divine providence in terms of election or predestination. And for those of you who know about this, I would argue that there is no such thing as single predestination. If you have single predestination, you automatically have double predestination. And so by inventing total depravity and double predestination, Augustine not only contradicted himself, he contradicted Scripture. Because if double predestination is real, then God is not love. What the original church taught is called synergy. It's the cooperation of the human will with the divine will. We do have the free will to respond to God's grace, but we do not have the power to overcome original sin on our own. So, did the original church teach original sin? Yes. Did the original church teach free will? Yes. One does not cancel out the other. And like so many things, the answer is not either or, but both and. St. Augustine's mistake was thinking of human freedom and God's grace as somehow in this inverse relationship, as though they are in competition with each other. But we are not in competition with God. We are invited to participate in what God is doing in our lives and in the world. And we're even expected to participate in our own salvation. This is why St. Paul said we work out our salvation with fear and trembling. In the original church, they knew that original sin means we are all born in this state of being estranged from God. And it also means we cannot bring about reconciliation with God or earn our own salvation through anything we can do. But it does not mean that we don't have free will or that we don't have the ability to respond to God's grace and participate in God's will. We do have that ability, and we do have that responsibility. And that's how it was in the original church. Thanks for joining me. Hey, thanks for watching this video all the way to the end. I really appreciate that. Please share this video with your friends, and please join me in the original church community on locals.com. Don't forget that if you join the original church community on locals.com, you can join me each week for a live, in-depth, chronological Bible study. It's live streamed every Saturday, but you can watch it later if you're not available. So join me for that, and I'll see you there. I hope to see you there. I hope to see you there, and I'll see you there.